I'm very happy that I have been asked to speak a few words about Venerable Anagarika Dharmapala. Srinathan Nayakathero, Kondanyathero, other Nayakatheros and members of the Mahasangha. Anagarika Dharmapala was born on 17th of September in 1864. He belonged to a very wealthy and aristocratic family. His father was Mudlia Don Karolis Hevavitarna. His mother was Mallika Hevavitarna. He had two younger brothers, one Dr. Charles and other one Edmund Hevavitarna. At the time he was born, it was customary to give English names because at that time Sri Lanka was a British colony named Ceylon. So Anagarika Dharmapala, when he was born, was given the name David. The schools at that time were missionary schools. There were very few government schools, but the vast majority were missionary schools belonging to the Roman Catholic and Protestant churches. And in these schools, the medium of instruction was English. And what was taught was Christianity. Sinhala and Buddhism were not taught. Anagarika Dharmapala, this young David, from very early age, was very analytical in nature. And he sort of imbibed a Buddhist Sinhala cultural outlook. Because of that, he could not accept what was taught in the Christian schools because for him they appeared very dogmatic. He learned Sinhala and Buddhism from two very eminent Buddhist monks. They were Venerable Migettuvatte Gunananda, sometimes called Mohottivatte Gunananda Nayakathero, and Hikkaduwe Sri Sumangala Nayakathero. He attended some of the best schools at that time. He had his primary education at St. Benedict's College, Kotahena, then Christian College, Kotte, St. Thomas's College in Mutwal, which later became Mount Lavinia, and Colombo Academy, the Royal College. In his life, at early stage, there were four people who contributed to the molding of his character, of his career. They were the two Nayakatheros, Migettuvatte Gunananda Nayakathero and Hikkaduwe Sri Sumangala Nayakathero, and Colonel Olcott and Madam Blavatsky. Colonel Olcott arrived in Colombo in May 1880. He and Madam Blavatsky proceeded to Gaul, where at Vijayananda Vihara in Velivatta, Gaul, they observed Panchasila, the 5 precepts. Later they came to Colombo and they were received by a group of distinguished Sri Lankans, including Mudlia Don Karolis Hevavitarna. This was the first time that young David met Colonel Olcott. He was 16 years old. From that time, He considered Alcott as his mentor, but later they became companions. After leaving school, young David worked in a government office for 3 years. During this time, he of course worked with Colonel Alcott mainly as a translator. And he was also encouraged to study Pali by Madame Blavatsky. After leaving government service after 3 years, he joined Colonel Alcott and Madame Blavatsky in their activities. Now in 1882, 2 years after Colonel Alcott came to Sri Lanka, he established what was called Buddhist Theosophical Society, commonly called BTS. At the time Alcott came, there wasn't a single Buddhist school in Sri Lanka. In 1907, when he passed away, there were 215 Buddhist schools. Most of the leading schools like Anand, Naland, Maind, Dharmaraja, Dharmasoka, or Malyadeva, all these schools were set up by BTS. And also, these schools produce some of the very distinguished Sri Lankans. And even today, there are a large number of alumni of these schools. After leaving government service and working with Alcott and Blavatsky, he decided to change his name. He dropped his English biblical name and adopted the name Dharmapala, meaning, of course, custodian of the Dharma. In 1884, 20-year-old Dharmapala, against the wishes of his parents, accompanied Alcott to Adyar in Chennai in India. When he returned with Alcott, he left home and moved to a room at the BTS office. And that day, he adopted the name Anagarika. Anagarika, of course, means homeless, but it is not in the way we understand homeless in big cities like New York, etc. Here it means non-householder, and that was the name he adopted, Anagarika Dharmapala. His international presence happened in 1887 when Colonel Alcott accompanied him to Japan. Colonel Alcott was invited to Japan to unify various Buddhist sects that were there. Now, after his mission, Alcott returned to Sri Lanka, but Dharmapala fell ill and he was kept in a hospital in Kyoto. He was suffering from rheumatic fever. Lot of people heard about this young leader, and they visited him in the hospital and established a very close relationship with the Buddhist leaders there. Now this paved the way for Buddhist Sri Lanka and Buddhist Japan to unite. 1,500 years after Parinibbana, Buddhism was the major belief system in Southeast Asia. But while it flourished in all other countries, in India, Buddhism declined for various reasons, including the Mughal invasions. So, by the 19th century, Buddhism has completely disappeared from India, the land of its birth, except for a very small community in East Bengal. 1886. Sir Edwin Arnold, the well-known author of Light of Asia and a Buddhist sympathizer, visited Buddha Gaya. He was very happy that he was inside the chamber near the place where Buddha attained enlightenment. But he was very sad to see the neglected state of the place. After returning to London, he wrote a series of articles to the London Daily Telegraph, of which he had been the editor earlier. And because of that, these articles were given very wide prominence in the news media. In this, he described how neglected Buddha Gaya is. Anagarika Dharmapala happened to read this and decided to go to Buddha Gaya. In 1891, he, accompanied by his Japanese friend Kosen Gunraddatero, went to Buddha Gaya. They actually went in a cart from Gaya to Buddha Gaya. And they saw on the way so many statues of the Buddha spread and scattered all over the place. When he came to Buddha Gaya, he found that the Mahabodhi Vihara was in charge of a Brahmin priest. He had converted a Buddha statue to a Hindu icon, and Buddhists were not allowed to worship there. Dharmapala went behind the Vihara, and under the Bodhi tree, he went near the Vajrasana, the diamond throne, actually where Buddha sat on a sandstone slab when he attained enlightenment. And this is how he recalled the thoughts that came to his mind. He says in his diary, as soon as I touched with my forehead the Vajrasana, a sudden impulse came to my mind to stop here and take care of this sacred spot. So sacred that nothing in the world is equal to this place where Prince Sakya Singha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. He returned to Colombo and then established what was called then Buddha Gaya Mahabodhi Society, which later came to be Mahabodhi Society. And next year, in 1892, Mahabodhi Society moved to Calcutta, where the headquarters was established. And that year, he filed action in courts for Buddhists to take control of Buddha Gaya. This went on for a very long time, and 2 years after his death, in 1935, the Bihar Parliament passed the Buddha Gaya Act, which gave equal rights to Buddhists for the control of Buddha Gaya. In 1893, Anagarika Dharmapala was invited to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. He was to represent what they at that time called Southern Buddhism. That was the name given to Theravada Buddhism. Dharmapala gave a memorable speech at this World Parliament of Religions. And this word spread all over the world, and even the American newspaper, St. Louis Observer of Missouri, stated like this: with black curly locks thrown from his broad brow, his clean, clear eyes fixed upon the audience, his long brown fingers emphasizing the utterances of his vibrant voice. He looked the very image of propagandist, and one trembled to know that such a figure stood at the head of the movement to consolidate all the disciples of Buddha and to spread the light of Asia throughout the world. Now this became a very important thing because, of course, today there are hundreds of Theravada temples belonging to Sri Lanka, Thailand, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam. But at that time, there wasn't a single Theravada Buddhist in the US. So the greatest thing he did that time was to introduce Theravada Buddhism to America. And it is very appropriate that his statue here is unveiled in the United States and alongside the statue of Colonel Olcott, because these two great pioneering heroes were responsible for the revival of Buddhism in Sri Lanka and India and the development of education. On his return, he stopped in Hawaii, where he met Mary Foster. She was so impressed with him that at that time she donated 1 million rupees to Dharmapala for his Buddhist activities. Later, she continued to be a benefactress and donated so much of money to Dharmapala for various activities. Now, for instance, she donated money for a free dispensary in Colombo on Mary Foster Lane, a lane named after Mary Foster, for a free dispensary. Then later she gave money to establish what was called Foster House in Ealing in London, which later in 1926 became the London Buddhist Vihara. Now that was the first Buddhist Vihara established outside Asia. And Dharmapala was also the first Buddhist leader to teach Buddhism in 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and North America. In 1931, Dharmapala received ordination and took the name Sri Devamitra Dharmapala. The following year, 1932, was the most memorable year in his career. At a second anniversary celebration of the Vihara in Isipatana, there was a very distinguished gathering, including Jawaharlal Nehru, Mrs. Nehru, daughter Indira Gandhi, and his sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit. Now, to this meeting in 1932, the old warrior was wheeled in an invalid chair. First, the most memorable thing happened. Director General of Archaeology of the Government of India donated to him a golden casket containing sacred relics of the Buddha. This was so important because after so many centuries, the first time that the sacred relics of the Buddha were given to a Sri Lankan. At this meeting, he recalled what happened when he first visited Isipatana. He said, "This is the place where Buddha preached the first sermon. This is the place where, that is Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra. This is the place where Buddha spent the first Vassana season. And it is such a sacred, holy place. But when he visited in 1891, except for a small area where there was a Jain shrine, the rest of the Isipatana land had been used for breeding of pigs. And this is what he said. After 800 years, the Buddhists have returned to their own holy Isipatana in Varanasi. It is the wish of the Mahabodhi Society to give to the people of India, without distinction of caste and creed, the compassionate doctrine of Samma Sambuddha. I trust that all of you would come forward to disseminate the Arya Dharma of the Tathagata throughout India. One of the first schools that was provided there was funded by Anagarika Dharmapala's mother, 85-year-old Mallika Hevavita. And there was another school funded by Mary Foster. Today, there are 8 schools funded and managed by the Mahabodhi Society. In 1933 January, Venerable Dharmapala received higher ordination. And few months later, he passed away. And his last words were, I wish to be reborn 25 times to spread the Dhamma of the Tathagata. I understand that Nayaka priest will be distributing a small leaflet about Anagarika Dharmapala. And I hope all of you will read it and also pass it on to the younger generation, because generally Sri Lankans do not know the contribution made by Dharmapala. Of course, as here in the US, you have a Kennedy Boulevard in every major city. In Sri Lanka, in every major town and city, there's a Dharmapala Mavata. But people do not know how much, except of course, people who have gone on pilgrimage to India. And you will realize how much he has done for the revival and the restoration of the Buddha places of worship. Now, to sum up, I like to emphasize some of the main things which is significant on this occasion. The significance of what Siddharatana Nayaka, with the assistance of Anura Perera and his other family members and Shanta Atalage, have done. First, installing the statue of Anagarika Dharmapala alongside the statue of Alcott, because these two great pioneers were responsible for the revival of Buddhism and the development of education. Secondly, this year is the 130th year of the formation of BTS, which is responsible for so many schools in the country. This is the 120th year after Dharmapala filed action to take control of Buddha Gaya. And it is the 80th anniversary of Anagarika Dharmapala receiving the sacred relics of the Buddha. Thank you very much for your attention. Bhavatu Sabba Mangalam. May you all be well and happy.
Thank you, Mr. Persinanakara. බොහොම ස්තුතියි අපේ පර්සිනානකර මහත්මයාට මේ උදාර කාර්යයේදී ධර්මපාලතුමා කවුද? අපි එතුමාට කරන සත්කාරය මොකක්ද කියන එක පැහැදිලි කිරීම පිළිබඳව.
අරහං සම්මා සම්බුද්ධෝ විද්‍යාචරණ සම්පන්නෝ සුගතෝ ලෝකවිදු අනුත්තරෝ පුරිස ධම්මසාරති සත්තා දේව මනුස්සානං බුද්ධෝ භගවාති ස්වාක්ඛාතෝ භගවතා ධම්මෝ සම්දිට්ඨිකෝ අකාලිකෝ ඒහි පස්සිකෝ ඕපනායිකෝ පච්චත්තං වේදිතබ්බෝ විඤ්ඤෝහිති සුපටිපන්නෝ භගවතෝ උජුපටිපන්නෝ භගවතෝ ශාවක සංඝෝ ඥායපටිපන්නෝ භගවතෝ ශාවක සංඝෝ සාමීච පටිපන්නෝ භගවතෝ ශාවක සංඝෝ යදිදං චත්තාරි පුරිස යුගානි අට්ඨ පුරිස ඒස භගවතෝ ශාවක සංඝෝ ආහුනේයෝ පාහුනේයෝ දක්ඛිනේයෝ අංජලි කරණීයෝ අනුත්තරං පුඤ්ඤක්ඛෙත්තං ලෝකස්සාති තේන සච්ච වජ්ජේන දුක්ඛා භයා රෝගා උප සමින්තු තේ සබ්බීතියෝ විවජ්ජන්තු සබ්බ රෝගෝ විනාස්සතු මාතේ භවත්වන්තරායෝ සුඛී දීඝායුකෝ භව භවතු සබ්බ මංගලං රක්ඛන්තු සබ්බ දේවතා සබ්බ බුද්ධානුභාවේන සදා සොත්ති භවන්තු තේ භවතු සබ්බ මංගලං රක්ඛන්තු සබ්බ දේවතා සබ්බ ධම්මානුභාවේන සදා සොත්ති භවන්තු තේ භවතු සබ්බ මංගලං රක්ඛන්තු සබ්බ දේවතා සබ්බ සංඝානුභාවේන සදා සොත්ති භවන්තු තේ